field notes on the lion, including the tale of Mr. Ryle's death and the story of the Majili Man-Eater. By Frederick Courteney Selous. Of all the multifarious forms of life with which the great African continent has been so bountifully stocked, none, not even excepting the half-reasoning elephant or the armed rhinoceros, has been responsible for such a wealth of anecdote and story, or has stirred the heart and imagination of mankind to such a degree as the lion, the great and terrible meat-eating cat, the monarch of the African wilderness, by night at least, whose life means constant death to all his fellow brutes. From the ponderous buffalo to the light-footed gazelle, and fear and often destruction too, to the human inhabitants of the countries through which he roams. How often has not the single word, Simba, Tau, Shumba, Siluan, or any other native African synonym for the lion, sent the blood tingling through the veins of a European traveller or hunter, or when whispered or screamed in the darkness of the night in a native village or encampment, brought terror to the hearts of men and women. When met in the light of day, a lion may be bold and aggressive, retiring, or even cowardly according to its individual character, and the circumstances under which it is encountered. But no one, I think, who has had anything like a long experience of the nature and habits of these great carnivora, can doubt that by night, particularly on a dark, rainy night, a hungry lion is a terrible and a terrifying beast to deal with. One day, towards the end of the year 1878, my friend Mr. Alfred Cross left our main camp on the Umfuli River in Mashuna land, and taking an empty wagon with him, went off to buy corn at some native villages about 20 miles distant. That same afternoon he outspanned early near a small stream running into the Umfuli as a heavy thunderstorm was threatening. A kraal was made for the oxen, behind which the Kafir boys arranged a shelter for themselves of boughs and dry grass as a protection from the anticipated downpour of rain. They also collected a lot of dry wood in order to be able to keep up a good fire. The wagon driver, a native of the Cape Colony, made his bed under the wagon, to the front wheel of which Mr. Cross's horse was fastened. As one of the hind oxen kept breaking out of the kraal, it was tied up by itself to the hind yoke close in front of the wagon. The trek chain, with the other yokes attached to it, was then stretched straight out along the ground in front of the wagon. Soon after dark, the thunderstorm, which had been gathering all the afternoon, burst forth with terrific violence. The rain fell in sheets, soon extinguishing the fires that had been lighted by the Kafirs, and the blinding flashes of lightning, which continually lit up both heaven and earth with blue-white light, were quickly succeeded by crashing peals of thunder. The storm had lasted some time, and the rain had almost ceased, when the ox, which was tied up all alone to the after yoke of the wagon, began to jump backwards and forwards over the wagon pole. Alfred Cross, who was then lying down inside the wagon, raised himself to a sitting position, and whilst calling to the ox to quiet it, crawled forward, and raising the foresheet, looked out. Just then, a vivid flash of lightning lit up the inky blackness of the night just for one brief moment. But the brilliant light revealed to my friend every detail of the surrounding landscape, and showed him with startling distinctness the form of a big male lion lying flat on the ground not 10 yards in front of the frightened ox, which it would probably already have seized had it not been for Cross's loud shouting. The lion had been no doubt creeping silently towards its would-be prey, which had already become aware of its proximity, when my friend's voice caused it to halt and lie flat on the ground, watching. By this time, Cross's dog, a well-bred pointer by the name of Ponto, which had been lying on the driver's blankets under the wagon, had become aware that something was wrong, though the lion was no doubt making its approach against the wind, and was standing just behind the ox, growling. Directly the position of the lion was revealed to him by the lightning, Cross seized his rifle, and calling to the wagon driver to jump up and hold his horse, took careful aim in the direction of the crouching brute, waiting for another flash of lightning. This was not long delayed, and showed the lion still lying flat on the ground close in front of the wagon. Cross fired at once. Encouraged by the report of the rifle, poor Ponto rushed boldly forward, past the terrified ox and into the black night, barking loudly. A yelp of fright or pain suddenly succeeded the bold barking of the dog, and poor Ponto's voice was stifled forever. He had rushed right into the lion's jaws and had been instantly killed and carried off. Fires were then made up again, but the lion, apparently satisfied with a somewhat light repast, did not give any further trouble. On the following morning, Cross could find no part of Ponto but the head. All the rest of him had apparently been eaten. I remember, even today, and with perfect distinctness, though I have not seen it for many years, a certain picture in Gordon Cummings' well-known book on African hunting, and the fearful fascination it always had for me when I was a small boy. That picture represented a great gaunt lion in the act of seizing one of the hunter's Hottentot servants, poor Hendrik, as he lay asleep by the campfire. But it left to the imagination all the horror and agony of mind suffered by the poor wretch, when so rudely awakened at dead of night and swiftly dragged away into the darkness to a cruel death. During the 60-odd years that have elapsed since this tragedy was enacted on the banks of the Limpopo River, many a similar incident has taken place. Some of these occurrences have come within the knowledge of and been described by European travelers and hunters. Yet these have been but isolated cases and can only represent a very small percentage of the number of natives that have been dragged away from their campfires or even killed in their huts by hungry lions within recent times. As a rule, I think a lion seizes a sleeping man by the head, and in that case, unless it is a very old and weakly animal, death must be usually instantaneous, as its great fang teeth will be driven into the brain through the thickest of skull. I have known of 2 instances of men having been seized at night by the shoulder. This, I think, is likely to happen to a sleeping man lying on his side with one shoulder raised, especially if his recumbent form should happen to be covered with a blanket, in which case the most prominent part of him would very likely be mistaken by a lion for his head. In the early 90s of the last century, 2 troopers of the British South Africa Company's police started one afternoon from the neighbourhood of Low Magondi's kraal to ride into Salisbury, the capital of Mashonaland, a distance of about 70 miles. They rode until dark, and then, off-saddling their horses, tied them to a tree, and after having had something to eat and cooked a pot of tea, lay down by the side of the campfire they had kindled, intending to sleep until the moon rose, and then continue their journey by its light. About midnight, however, and when it was very dark, for the moon had not yet risen, a prowling lion came up to their lonely bivouac, and, disregarding their horses, seized one of them by the shoulder and at once dragged him away into the darkness. His companion, awakened by his cries, quickly realized what had happened, and, snatching up his rifle, ran to his friend's assistance and fired 2 or 3 shots into the air in quick succession. This so startled the lion that it dropped its prospective supper and made off. The wounded man, it was found, had received a severe bite in the shoulder when the lion first seized him, but fortunately had not suffered any further injuries, and was able to proceed with his friend to Salisbury as soon as the moon had risen. He had to be sent to the hospital on his arrival there, as although his injuries were not very serious, any wound inflicted by the teeth of a lion is, as a rule, very difficult to heal unless carefully attended to at once and cauterized with a strong lotion of carbolic acid. Dr. Livingston has described how he suffered for years from the bite of a lion, and I have myself seen wounds from the teeth of one of these animals in a horse's neck which had never been properly attended to, still suppurating 13 months after they had been inflicted, whilst on the other hand I have seen wounds from the bite of a lion which were cauterized at once heal up very quickly and never reopen. Of all the lion stories that I have ever heard or read, I think none equals in dramatic interest the thrilling narrative of Mr. J.H. Patterson's experiences with 2 man-eaters during the construction of the Uganda Railway in 1898. This very remarkable story, a brief account of which I first read some years ago with the most absorbing interest in the field newspaper, been incorporated in the record of his experiences in East Africa, which Colonel Patterson has recently published under the title of The Man-Eaters of Tsavo. Mr. Patterson at last succeeded in ridding the country of both of these dreaded beasts, but not before they had killed and eaten 28 Indian coolies employed upon the construction of the Uganda Railway, and caused such a panic through the countryside that at one time it looked as if the building of the railway would have to be abandoned altogether for the time being. The death of Mr. C.H. Ryle, the Assistant Superintendent of the East African Police Force, who was killed by a man-eating lion inside a railway carriage on the Uganda Railway, is also a most interesting episode, as it shows how extraordinarily bold a hungry lion may become when in search of prey during the hours of darkness. When I was in East Africa a few years ago, I met both the other 2 Europeans, Mr. Hubner, a German, and Mr. Parenti, an Italian, who were in the carriage with Mr. Ryle when he was killed, and I heard the story of the tragedy from their lips. The railway carriage in question, which contained a small saloon and an adjoining servants' compartment, had been pulled onto a siding close to a small station on the Uganda Railway in order to give its occupants the chance of getting a shot at a man-eating lion which had lately been giving trouble in the neighborhood, either as it came prowling about during the night or by hunting it up the next morning. There was a small window on each side of the little saloon and a sliding door at the end of the carriage. Both the windows and the door were wide open. Mr. Ryle took the first watch, and seems to have taken up a position on one of the seats of the carriage with his back to the open window. His head and shoulders would therefore probably have been visible to the eyes of a nocturnal animal from outside. Mr. Hubner turned in and went to sleep on one of the top berths in the carriage, and Mr. Parenti made his bed on the floor. It is probable, I think, that Mr. Ryle also went to sleep after a time. What happened afterwards I will now relate as it was told to me by Mr. Parenti.
I was awakened from a sound sleep by the sensation of a weight holding me down on the floor, and for a moment was unable to move. Then the weight was taken off me, and I raised my head with a jerk. My face immediately came in contact with a soft, hairy body, and I became conscious of a disagreeable smell. In an instant, I realized that there was a lion in the railway carriage, and at that moment it was killing poor Mr. Ryle, as I heard a sort of gurgling noise, the only sound he ever made.
Mr. Hubner seems to have awakened at the same time, and to have at once jumped down onto the floor of the carriage, where he and Mr. Parenti and the lion were all mixed up together. At this time, the weight of the lion and the struggling men combined slightly tipped the carriage to one side, causing the sliding door to close automatically, and thus materially increasing the horror of the situation. Mr. Parenti, as soon as he could collect his thoughts, made his escape from the carriage through the open window opposite to the one against which poor Mr. Ryle had been sitting when the lion seized him. And Mr. Hubner burst open the door communicating with the smaller compartment occupied by Mr. Ryle's 2 Indian servants, who, having become aware that there was a lion in the other room with the sahibs, were holding the door against the crowd with all their strength. Mr. Hubner, however, who is a heavy, powerful man, soon overcame their resistance. To do it justice, this lion does not seem to have had any wish to make itself unnecessarily disagreeable. It wanted something to eat, but having got hold of Mr. Ryle, seems never to have paid the smallest of attention to anyone else. In all probability, I think it had seen its victim's back and head from outside against the open window, and coming round to the open door, had entered the carriage and made straight for him, treading on Mr. Parenti's sleeping form as it crossed the floor. It seized Mr. Ryle by the throat just under the jaw and must have reared itself up, probably resting its forepaws on the seat of the carriage to have done so. Mr. Ryle must have been killed by the first bite almost instantaneously, as he never seems to have struggled or made any noise but a low gurgling sound. The windows of the carriages on the Uganda Railway are small, but after having killed Mr. Ryle, this lion, a big male, succeeded in carrying off his body through the comparatively small opening. It probably never relaxed its hold on his throat until it had got his dead body safely out of the carriage and pulled it away to some distance. The half-eaten remains of the unfortunate man were recovered the next day nearly a mile away from the railway carriage in which he had met his death. But the lion was nowhere to be found, and in spite of a large reward offered for its destruction, it was some time before this bold and dangerous beast was disposed of. At last, however, it was caught alive in a big cage trap made by a Mr. Costello, who at that time was the station master at Makindu on the Uganda Railway. After having been photographed, this lion was shot. This photograph was shown to me by Mr. Costello himself, who told me that the captured animal was old and mangy, with very worn teeth and claws, and a short, scrubby mane. He thought that there could be no reasonable doubt that it was the lion that had killed poor Mr. Ryle, but of course nobody can be absolutely certain on this point. Natives living in very small communities in wild districts where game being still abundant, lions also are consequently fairly numerous, are often troubled at night by these animals. In such cases, a man-eating lion usually proves to be an old and almost worn-out beast, which having grown too weak to catch and kill its usual prey, has been driven by hunger to approach the haunts of men. Urged on by its desperate need, such a lion knows no fear, and will not hesitate to enter a small native village, or even to force its way into a hut in search of food. In 1879, whilst hunting elephants in the country to the east of the Chobe or Quito River, I met with a very primitive tribe of natives living in families or very small communities in isolated villages along the bank of the river. Their huts were of the flimsiest description, being formed of a light framework of poles, over which a few grass mats had been stretched. But the 2 or 3, up to half a dozen ill-made huts which formed each village were always surrounded and protected by a carefully made stockade, the poles forming which were all sharpened at the end and hardened by having been charred in the fire, and so placed that they slanted outwards and would have been very difficult to surmount from the outside. The natives informed me that they had taken this trouble as a defense against lions. One morning, in the same district, I came upon most of the skeleton of a man who had been killed and eaten by a lion a few days before. He had evidently been sitting or lying by a fire when caught, and had probably been overtaken by darkness when on his way from one village to another. This man's spears lay close to his bones, so that he must have been holding them in his hand when he was seized. None of my Kafirs would touch them. Apparently, it was not etiquette to meddle with the belongings of a dead man, though I think that most of the members of my retinue would not have been above stealing anything they might have found lying about, belonging to a live one. In April 1878, a lion entered a small Banyai village near the river Umai in northern Matabele land a short time after I had left it, and not being able to make its way into any of the huts through the small doorways, all of which had been very carefully barricaded, climbed on the roof of one of them, and tearing away the grass thatching, forced its way in from the top. There were 3 or 4 women inside the hut, and it killed them all. But having gorged itself, was apparently unable to make its escape through the roof again, and was speared to death by the men of the village the next morning through the framework of the hut, after the mud plaster had been removed in places. A native servant of my own, whom I had left behind in this village, was present when this lion was killed, and he told me that as soon as it was dead, a huge bonfire was built, on which the carcass of the man-eater was thrown, and the fire kept up until it was quite consumed. The most cunning and destructive man-eating lion, probably because it was not an old and weakly animal, but in the prime of life, that I ever heard of in South Africa, was one which once haunted the neighborhood of the Majili River, a tributary of the central Zambezi from the north. I gave some account of the doings of this bold and ferocious beast in the course of an article which I contributed to the pages of the Fortnightly Review some 20 years ago. And as I have the kind permission of the editor and proprietor of that publication to do so, I will now retell the story as I originally heard it from one of my own native servants shortly after the occurrences related took place. In the early part of 1886, two half-caste elephant hunters, Henry Wall and Black Yantje, the latter for several years both before and after this time a trusted servant of my own, crossed the Zambezi River at its junction with the Quito or Chobe in order to hunt elephants in the country to the north between the Majili and Ungwesi rivers. They soon heard from the natives that there was a man-eating lion in the district which had already killed several people, and they were therefore careful to see that a strong fence was made every night behind their camp, and sufficient dry wood collected to keep up good fires during the hours of darkness. The two half-civilized hunters were accustomed to sleep by themselves within a strong semicircular fence, the open end of which was protected by a large fire. All but one of their native boys, Wild Batongas and Masubias, slept together, lying in a row with a strong fence behind them and a succession of fires near their feet. The boy, who would not sleep with the others, always lay by one or other of the fires by himself. One night, Henry Wall, who was a very light sleeper and had perhaps been dreaming of lions, was awakened, as he afterwards declared, by the sound of a low growl or purr close to him. Springing to his feet, he shouted out, "The Liu is here!" or "The lion's here! Wake up, Yantje!" But Yantje and all the other Kafirs were fast asleep, and it was not until they had been awakened and questioned that it was discovered that the man who had been lying by one of the fires all alone was gone. Where he had gone and why was not left long in doubt, for almost immediately a lion was heard eating his remains close behind the encampment. Henry Wall and Yantje at once fired in the direction of the sound, on which the lion retired to a safer distance with its prey. As soon as it was broad daylight, the hunters took up the spoor of the lion, which was, they told me, quite easy to follow through the dewy grass. It was not long before they saw it walking slowly along with its head half turned, holding the dead man by one shoulder, so that his legs dragged at its side. As soon as it became aware that it was being followed, it dropped its prey, and wheeling round, stood looking at its pursuers, twitching its tail and growling angrily. Henry Wall, who was a very good shot and a cool and courageous man, now tried to fire. But the old, clumsy, muzzle-loading elephant gun he was using only snapped the cap. At this juncture, Yantje, who was a little to one side, was unable to fire because there was a bush in his way, and before Henry Wall could get another cap on the nipple of his gun, the Kafir, who carried his second weapon, fired at and missed the lion, which instantly turned and, running into a patch of bush, made good its escape. On examination, it was found that the dead man had been seized by the head. He must have been killed instantaneously, as the two upper canine teeth had been driven through the top of the skull, whilst one of the lower ones had entered beneath the jaw and broken the bone. During the night, the corpse had been disemboweled and all the flesh eaten off the thighs and buttocks. A few days later, a native family was attacked, not far from the scene of the episode I have just recounted, and almost certainly by the same lion. All over Africa, wherever game is plentiful, it is customary for the natives, at the season when their crops are ripening, to build huts in their fields in which they spend the night and endeavor to keep buffaloes, elephants, and all kinds of antelopes out of their corn by shouting and beating tom-toms. The huts are often built on the top of platforms raised 10 or 12 feet above the ground and reached by a ladder. The native family in question occupied 2 huts, a large one built on the ground and a small one on the top of a platform. The large hut was occupied by a woman and her 2 children, whilst her husband kept watch alone in the little open hut above. One night, the dreaded man-eater of the Majili came prowling round, and scenting the native on the platform, either sprang up and seized him with its teeth, or more probably, I think, half clambered up by the help of the ladder and dragged him from his shelter with its claws. At any rate, it bore him to the ground and speedily killed him, but not before he had made a good deal of noise, as reported afterwards by his children. His wife, awakened by the cries of her husband, opened the door of her hut and rushed out, leaving the 2 children inside. The lion at once left the man, who was by then dead, and seizing the woman, killed her quickly. It never returned to the body of the man at all, but ate all the fleshy parts of the woman, retiring into the bush before daylight and never revisiting the corpses. All through the dry season, this lion kept the natives in the neighborhood of the Majili River in a constant state of alarm, and whilst adding steadily to the number of its victims, baffled every attempt made to hunt it down and destroy it. After having been away for some months hunting elephants in the country farther north, Henry Wall and Black Yatche once again camped on the Majili River on their way back to the Zambezi, and for the second time the man-eater paid them a visit. This time Yatche was awake, and hearing, as he told me, a low purring growl, jumped up and calling out, "That's the Lew-Weeder," or "That's the lion again." At the same time, one of the Kafirs stood up, holding his hand to his head. "What's the matter with you?" asked Yatche, going up to him. "I don't know," answered the man. "Something hit me on the head." At this moment, Yatche saw, by the light of the fire, blood running down his neck, and called out, "Wake, wake! It was the lion! I heard! Wake, wake, and see if everyone is here!" It soon appeared that one of the Kafirs was missing, and this is no doubt what had happened. The lion must have crept or sprung in amongst the sleepers, and seizing one of them by the head, must have killed him instantly and carried him off. But in doing so, it must have struck the man lying next to him on the head with one of its paws, and inflicted a slight scalp wound with one of its claws. The body of the man who had been carried off was not recovered, because, as Henry Wall and Yatche told me, the rest of the Kafirs would give them no assistance in following up the lion the next day. This dangerous man-eater was at last mortally wounded by the spears of 2 young men, whom it attacked in broad daylight close to a small native village. One of these youths died the same evening from the mauling he received in the encounter, but he had driven his spear into the lion's chest when it attacked him, and his companion had also struck it in the side with the light-throwing spear. The next day, all the men from the 2 or 3 little villages in the neighborhood turned out and followed up the bloody tracks of the wounded lion. They had not far to go, for the grim beast lay dead, with the 2 spears still sticking in it, within a short distance from the spot where it had attacked the 2 young men the previous day. As is the custom when man-eating lions are killed in the interior of Africa, a great quantity of dry wood was then collected, and a huge fire lighted, on which the carcass was thrown and utterly consumed. There is one rather curious fact in connection with the history of this notorious man-eating lion, which I omitted from the first account I wrote of its doings, but which I will now relate as it is of some interest. Soon after dark, on the night of the second attack on their camp, Henry Wall and Yatche and all their boys heard the sudden rush of an affrighted herd of buffaloes, which had been feeding in the open ground between their camp and the Majili River. Suddenly, there was the loud and agonized bellow of a buffalo in pain and terror, and they all knew that one of these animals had been seized by a lion. The following morning, they found a buffalo cow lying dead, not 200 yards from their camp, with its head twisted in under it and its neck dislocated. It had the claw marks usual in such cases over the muzzle and on the shoulder, showing the manner in which it had been seized, but after having been killed, it had not been touched. The tracks of the lion, however, led from the carcass of the buffalo to the hunter's camp, and I think that there can be no doubt that it was the same animal which killed the buffalo that a few hours later carried off a human being. If so, it proves two things. Firstly, that this man-eating lion must have been in its prime, for it requires a strong and vigorous male lion to kill a full-grown buffalo cow or a heavy bullock neatly and quickly by breaking its neck. And secondly, that it preferred human flesh to that of a buffalo. It must either have been the gleam of the campfires for the first time immediately after it had killed the buffalo and abandoned the carcass in the hope of obtaining more succulent food, or if it was aware of the neighborhood of the hunter's camp before it attacked the buffalo, it must have killed the latter out of sheer mischief. Though similar cases of lions becoming confirmed man-eaters when in the prime of life and still in the enjoyment of their full strength and vigor do from time to time occur, the celebrated Tsavo man-eaters, which played such a havoc amongst the construction camps on the Uganda Railway, were reported to have been far from old. Yet it cannot be denied that in the vast majority of cases a lion only takes to killing human beings in its declining years and when its strength is failing. On this subject, Dr. Livingston wrote many years ago, "A man-eater is invariably an old lion, and when he overcomes his fear of man, so far as to come to villages for goats, the people remark, 'His teeth are worn, he will soon kill men.' They at once acknowledge the necessity of instant action and turn out to kill him." Speaking generally, nothing truer could have been written than these sentences, but there are exceptions to every rule, and when a strong and vigorous lion does take to preying upon human beings, it is naturally not so easy to hunt down and destroy as would be an old and weakly beast whose teeth are worn. An adult male lion is probably possessed of greater strength in proportion to its size and weight than any other African animal. It will kill with astonishing ease and dexterity a full-grown buffalo cow or the heaviest of bullock, and probably sometimes a buffalo bull or a giraffe. I never remember, however, to have seen the carcass of an old buffalo bull that had palpably been killed by a single lion, whilst I have shot several buffalo bulls that had escaped from lions after receiving very severe wounds from their teeth and claws. I once had a very good opportunity of noting the manner in which a big male lion killed a heavy ox, which would certainly have scaled more than twice its own weight. This ox was killed during the night, but as the lion was immediately driven from the carcass, it had no time to inflict any wound upon it other than those made when it first seized its victim, and the ground being soft from recent rain, every step taken by both the ox and the lion during the brief struggle was plainly visible. The lion had evidently crept close to where the ox was lying, within 40 yards of my wagon, and had either attacked it where it lay or just as it was rising to its feet. It had not jumped upon its victim, but throughout the struggle had always kept its hind feet on the ground. The only wounds that had been inflicted on the ox were claw marks on the nose and on the top of the left shoulder blade, and the lion had evidently seized it by the muzzle with its left paw and on the top of the shoulder with the right, and had simply held it, pulling its head in towards its chest. The ox had plunged forward, dragging the lion with it for a few yards, and had then fallen with its head twisted right under it and its neck dislocated. Whether the lion had broken the ox's neck by its own strength, or whether the dislocation was due to the way in which it fell with its head twisted in under it, I cannot say. But my experience is that when a single lion tries to kill an ox or a buffalo, it invariably seizes it over the muzzle with one paw and usually succeeds in either breaking its victim's neck or causing it to break it itself by its own weight in falling. When several lions attack an ox or a buffalo, they will often bite and tear it all over and take a long time to kill it. Upon several occasions, I have listened to the protracted bellowing of buffaloes being thus mauled to death. Upon one occasion, a party of 5 lions stampeded my oxen as they lay around the wagon, and very soon seized and pulled down one of them. The wretched creature bellowed most fearfully and must have been suffering terribly. Hastily lighting torches of long dry grass, several of my Kafirs and I ran to help it. The blazing grass scared the lions off, and they left the ox before the light of the torches reached them. The wounded animal immediately got up and rushed off again into the darkness, but had not gone far before its loud bellowing told us the lions had got hold of it once more. They took some time to kill it, but its agonized bellowings gradually died away in low moans, until at length all was quiet again. During the approach of these 5 lions to my camp, and the subsequent chase, and the long drawn-out killing of the ox, not one of them made the slightest sound. And as far as my own personal experience goes, with one exception, whenever lions have reconnoitered or attacked my camp at night, and bitten or killed any of my native followers or cattle or horses, they have done all their stalking and killing without making a sound. If disturbed, however, they always growl loudly. On the occasion I have referred to as an exception to this rule, 3 lions, as we learned the next morning by the spoor, came quite close up to my bivouac one night in northern Mashuna land, and one of them gave a very loud roar, which woke us all up. I was travelling at the time with a small cart and 8 oxen, which were tied to the yokes and were right in the open, unprotected either by fires or any kind of kraal or fence. My 2 horses were tied to one of the wheels, and my few native servants and myself were lying close to them with a small fence of soft bush behind us. The 3 lions that came so near to us in the night could not have been very hungry, or they would assuredly have seized one of my oxen. Perhaps the one that so suddenly roared only did so with the idea of frightening the oxen, and if one of them had broken the raw hide thong with which it was fastened to the yoke, and run off away from our camp, all 3 of them would very likely have pursued and killed it. Fortunately, neither my oxen nor my horses showed much fear on this occasion, and although the former pulled a bit, they did not break their thongs, and we soon quieted them down and then built up some big fires. The lions passed on up the little river near which we were camped, and before long began to roar loudly, a pretty good sign, I think, that they had already dined and were not hunting. Why, when a family of 4 or 5 lions are hunting together, one of their number being an old male, they should kill an ox so much less artistically than the old male would have done, if he had been alone, I do not know. Possibly the eagerness of each member of the party renders a scientific attack by any one of them impossible, or perhaps the older lions allow the younger ones to do the killing for practice. There is no doubt, I think, that lions know that the head, throat, and the back of the neck are the most vital spots in all animals on which they prey. Human beings are nearly always seized by the head or neck. Horses, donkeys, and zebras are almost invariably killed by bites in the back of the neck just behind the ears, or by bites in the throat, whilst they either dislocate the necks of heavy animals like buffaloes or hold them in such a way that they can hardly help falling and breaking their own necks. The lion which broke the neck of one of my oxen, as I have described above, escaped punishment when it returned to the carcass the following evening owing to my rifle missing fire. It then visited a mining camp close at hand, and forcing its way into an enclosure in which there were 14 sheep and goats and 1 calf, it killed every one of these unfortunate animals. I shot this lion early the following morning and then examined its victims. Every one of them, the calf as well as the sheep and the goats, had been killed by a single bite in the head. In each case, the upper canine teeth had been driven through the top of the skull or the back of the neck just behind the ears. I once came on a young elephant only a few minutes after it had been killed by a lion. The only wounds I could find were deep tooth marks in the throat. Lions kill and eat every kind of wild animal in Africa, with the exception of the pachydermata, though they occasionally catch and kill a young elephant or rhinoceros that has been separated from its mother, but as long as buffaloes and zebras are plentiful in the countries they inhabit, they will kill far more of these than any other animal. Quecas and Burchell's zebras probably formed their chief food on the plains of the Cape Colony, the Orange River Colony and the Transvaal, before those countries were settled by Europeans, whilst farther north, where great numbers of buffaloes frequented the neighbourhood of every river, the lions lived almost entirely on these animals, following the herds in all their wanderings, just as in North America the prairie wolves are always in attendance on the bisons. Giraffes, too, are sometimes killed by lions, but according to my experience, only very rarely. No doubt because they must be very awkward animals to pull down, and also for the reason that, generally speaking, they inhabit dry, waterless stretches of country throughout which game is usually only sparsely distributed and into which lions do not penetrate. Although I have excluded the pachydermata from the list of animals on which lions prey, there nevertheless seems to be good evidence that these carnivora do sometimes attack and kill good-sized cow elephants. I well remember an old boar hunter, Michael Engelbrecht, telling me of an unsuccessful attack made by lions on a cow elephant within a short distance of the shooting hole where he was lying one night watching for elephants coming to drink at Tamasanka Valley on the old road to the Zambezi. This incident had occurred only a few nights before I met Engelbrecht at the valley in question. But it happened so long ago, in 1874, that I cannot remember anything more than that the elephant was held up by the lions for some hours, and that the trumpeting of the former was accompanied by the loud growling of the latter, and that when my informant examined the ground where the combat had taken place the next morning, he found a great deal of thorn bush trampled down by the elephant and some blood on the ground. The former, however, although probably it had been badly bitten in the trunk and legs, had kept the lions from its throat and had finally beaten them off and made good its retreat. Michael Engelbrecht was at that time a man of over 60 years of age, and as he had been a hunter from his youth upwards in the golden days of South African hunting, he must have had a vast experience of the habits of wild animals. But I well remember that he spoke of this incident of an elephant having been attacked by lions as wonderful and almost incredible. I have, however, heard of another case of an elephant having been attacked and killed by lions. When passing through Kimberley in 1895, I met my old friend Mr. F.S. Arnott, who has done such splendid work as a pioneer missionary in Central Africa, and who is an absolutely reliable man, and he then told me a story of an elephant having been killed by lions near Lake Mweru. Hearing last year that Mr. Arnott was in England, I wrote and asked him if he would kindly tell me the story again, as I wanted to put it on record. In the course of his answer to my letter, Mr. Arnott wrote,
"The lion story I told you may appear rather tall to some, but when traveling between Lakes Tanganyika and Mweru in November 1894, and when skirting the northern end of the Great Mweru Marsh, a regular elephant's stronghold, my men suddenly left me en masse. They were a raw set of men, returning presently with elephant flesh. They then told me that our guides having informed them that they had that morning seen 6 hungry lions attack and pull down a full-grown cow elephant just ahead of where we then were, they had left me so suddenly in order to drive the lions off and get some meat. Unfortunately, I did not see the lions myself, but there could be no doubt about the truth of our guide's statement, for I saw the lion's spoor and the carcass of the dead elephant. The tusks were very small, but my men brought them. They may have weighed from 4 to 5 pounds each."
As the tusks were so small, this elephant could hardly have been a full-grown cow, but it must have been a good-sized animal, probably a young cow about 3 parts grown. It is a great pity that Mr. Arnott did not examine the carcass carefully and ascertain exactly how the elephant had been killed. As the natives, however, asserted positively that they had seen 6 lions attack and kill it, and as Mr. Arnott is fully convinced that their story was true, I think it ought to be accepted as fact, especially as cases of full-grown elephants having been killed by tigers in India have been put on record. When a previously uninhabited piece of country is invaded and settled up by a tribe of natives or by Europeans, lions are always very troublesome, as they look upon all the newly introduced domestic animals as some new species of game specially brought into the country for their benefit. For the first few months after Mr. Cecil Rhodes's pioneers entered Mashonaland in 1890, I kept as accurate an account as I could of the number of horses, donkeys, oxen, sheep, goats, and pigs that were killed by lions, and it soon amounted to more than 200. During the same time, 2 white men were killed and several others severely injured by lions. The saddest case was that of a young man named Teal, who had come to Mashonaland in the hope of making his fortune by market gardening. He was outspanned one night near a native village not far from Umtali, where he had gone to buy grain. His 4 oxen were tied to the yokes, and he, with his native driver, was sleeping on the ground beneath his 2-wheeled cart, when he was seized and carried off by a lion. What the lion did not eat of him, the hyenas probably got, as nothing was ever found of him but his head and 1 foot with the boot still on it. A rather curious incident happened the following year at a farm on the Hanyani River about 40 miles from Salisbury. The owner of the farm, from whom I heard this story, which was fully corroborated by his native servants, was breeding pigs and had a large number of these animals in a series of pens, separated from one another by low partitions, but all under one thatched roof. One night, a lioness managed to force her way into the piggery between 2 poles, and after having satisfied her hunger, was apparently unable to find her way out again, and either became angry or frightened, or else must have been overcome with an almost insatiable lust for killing. At any rate, she wandered backwards and forwards through the pens and killed almost all the pigs, over 100 altogether, each one with a bite in the head or the back of the neck. She had only eaten portions of 2 young pigs. She managed to effect her escape before daylight, but returned the following night and was shot by a set gun. I saw her skull, which was that of a full-grown lioness with good teeth. There appears to be a considerable difference of opinion as to the means usually adopted by lions to effect an entrance by night into a cattle kraal or a camp surrounded by a fence. They are often said to leap boldly over high fences and stockades. In my own experience, I have not known them to do this. They will walk through any opening in an enclosure, but in the absence of such a means of ingress, I have always found that they got inside by creeping through the fence even when it was low and very thick and thorny. I have known a lion to walk round and round a stockaded cattle kraal and at last force its way in by pressing 2 poles apart and squeezing through the opening thus made. Should lions, however, be disturbed and suddenly fired at whilst feeding on a bullock which they have killed inside an enclosure, they will almost always jump over the fence in their hurry to escape. I have never seen any evidence of a lion killing its prey by striking it a heavy blow with one of its paws, and I believe that it always endeavors to kill by biting, and only uses its claw for holding or pulling an animal to its mouth. I have seen both a lion and a lioness bayed by dogs repeatedly throw out their forepaws like lightning when one of these latter came near them. But the movement was not in the nature of a blow, but rather an attempt to hook one of the dogs in their claws and draw it to them. Lions, I think, must often lose their prey through the very sharpness of their claws, which cut like knives through the skin and flesh of a heavy animal in motion. I have known several instances of a lion overtaking a horse that had only had a short start. In such a case, a lion will not land with a flying leap right onto a horse's back. It gallops close along the ground until it is almost under the horse's tail, and then, rearing itself up on its hind legs, seizes it on either flank, endeavoring to hold it with the protruded claws of its great forepaws. But almost invariably, in such a case, it fails to stop a galloping horse, its claws simply cutting great gashes through skin and flesh. I once saw a lion chasing 4 kudus in broad daylight, though on a cold, cloudy morning. It was galloping after them flat along the ground as hard as it could go, and looked like an enormous mastiff, especially as, though a male, it had but little mane. On another occasion, late one evening, I saw a lion and 2 lionesses lying in wait for some cattle of mine which were feeding towards them. Every now and then, one or other of the lions would raise its head for a moment above the grass to see that the oxen were still coming on, lowering it again after one quick look. But for my intervention, these lions would probably have lain quite still until one or other of the oxen had fed close up to them, when they would have seized it by the head before it had time to turn. As lions nearly always hunt by scent and by night, they no doubt come upwind and approach as near as possible to a herd of game before making an attack, and probably often lie quite still until some animal feeds right onto them. In a country where game is plentiful, one would imagine that on a dark night, lions must have but little trouble in securing food, and this is no doubt the case, as these carnivora become excessively fat wherever game is really plentiful. When a lion charges, it does not come on in great leaps, nor does it strike its adversary a crushing blow with its paw. It comes along close to the ground like a great dog and bites, often so low that its 4 feet can hardly be off the ground. 2 boar hunters of my acquaintance were both of them first bitten in the thigh. Shortly after the opening up of Mashonaland, an Englishman and a Dane were both seized in the same way by charging lions when hunting near the Pungwe River in Portuguese East Africa, the latter dying from his wounds. In 1877, an Englishman was charged by an unwounded lion in Mashonaland and severely bitten in the groin, and in the following year, in the same locality, an old Hottentot servant of mine was badly bitten in the small of the back when running away from a charging lion which he had previously wounded. All these wounds were so low down that they must have been inflicted when a lion's 4 feet were on the ground. On the other hand, many cases are on record of men standing facing charging lions being seized by the left forearm and sometimes by the shoulder. I do not remember to have heard of a case of a man being bitten in the head in a frontal charge, but one of my old servants, Black Yanche, described to me very minutely the way in which he saw from a distance of only a few yards a bushman killed by a wounded lion. When the lion charged, everyone ran, and just as Black Yanche reached a small tree, it dashed past him, and the next instant caught up to a bushman. It appeared, Yanche told me, to rear itself up, and placing a forepaw on each shoulder, gave the unfortunate savage a bite in the head. There were no wounds on the man's shoulders, but his skull was bitten through, and he was dashed to the ground with such violence that the skin was knocked off both his knees. The wounded lion made no further attack, but walking slowly away to the foot of a neighboring tree, lay down, and presently died within a few yards of its dead enemy. 2 cases have come within my experience of lions charging home, and after having thrown their adversaries to the ground with one severe bite, leaving them without further molestation. I have known personally a number of men who had been mauled by lions. Every one of them was bitten, not struck by the lion's paw. Indeed, most of them were absolutely untouched by the lion's claws. I once galloped almost onto a lion lying flat on the ground in grass only about a foot in height before I saw it. When I at last made it out, I was directly in front of it and probably less than 20 yards away from it. As I pulled my horse in, this lion had its head pressed down on its outstretched paws, and its eyes were fixed upon me. Had I ridden by, it would certainly never have moved until I had got out of sight. As I raised my rifle and looked down the barrel to align the sights upon its head, I saw the black tuft of hair at the end of its tail flicked lightly from side to side, and the forepaws that had been stretched out straight beyond its nose, without its head or body being perceptibly raised. I knew the lion was on the very point of charging, but my horse kept breathing hard, and I could not get my sight steadily fixed below its eyes. Then, just as I saw the crouching beast's hind quarters quivering, or rather moving gently from side to side, I fired, and luckily my bullet struck it just between the eyes, and crashing into its prey killed it instantly, so that it never moved but still lay crouching on the ground, struck dead at the very last moment before starting on its charge. Since that time, I have on several occasions watched a cat, when stalking a bird, go through every movement made by that lion, the same apparently involuntary twitching of just the end of the tail, the same drawing in of the forepaws beneath the chest, and then the wavy movement of the loins just before the final rush. As lions are very nocturnal in their habits and usually hunt by night, it is of course very unusual to see them approach and kill their prey, but from the above related experience, I imagine that every movement made by a lion in approaching and finally making a rush upon an antelope or zebra is represented exactly in miniature by a cat stalking a bird or a rabbit. When animals are killed quickly by lions, they probably suffer very little, if at all, but no one who has listened, as I have done, to the bellowing of an ox or a buffalo being killed by inches could possibly say that such an animal's sufferings were not very great. I once had a fine stallion donkey killed by a hyena within a short distance of my bivouac. It had first been seized between the hind legs by its foul assailant, and its screams were perfectly heart-rending and haunted me for a long time afterwards. My Kafirs and I ran to the poor brute's assistance at once, but were too late to save it, as a great hole had been torn in its belly, out of which half its entrails were hanging. No, it is useless for the scientist or the divine to tell an old hunter that there is no cruelty in nature, because the man who has spent many years of his life in a wild country knows by actual experience that such an assertion is not true. In appearance, a full-maned, well-proportioned lion lying in peaceful repose in a European menagerie, gazing placidly and thoughtfully out of sleepy brownish-yellow eyes at the human crowd beyond the bars of its cage, is a truly dignified and majestic-looking animal. And if a fine specimen of a wild lion could be viewed at close quarters, and at a moment when it was lying or standing with its massive mane-encircled head well raised, content with itself and all the world after a good meal, and entirely unconscious of danger, it also would doubtless look both dignified and majestic, though I doubt if it could ever look quite so reposeful as the typical lion of the picture books. For although wild lions are sometimes caught fast asleep, they are usually alert and watchful. Many lions certainly seem to die in early cubhood, and this may be a provision of nature to check their inordinate increase. But that neither they nor any other species of carnivorous animal in Africa ever become so numerous under the most favorable conditions as to seriously diminish the numbers of the animals on which they prey is a well-ascertained fact. One of the most distinguishing characteristics of a lion, and the one which perhaps differentiates it more than anything else from all other members of the cat tribe, is its roar. During more than 20 years spent in hunting and pioneering in the African wilderness, I have heard lions roaring under all sorts of conditions, in the stillness of frosty winter nights when the campfire blazed merrily, and as each fresh log was thrown upon it sent up showers of sparks towards the cloudless star-decked sky, or amidst the crashing thunder peals and blinding flashes of lightning of a stormy night during the rainy season, when it was sometimes quite impossible to keep a fire alight at all. On such a night, when sitting wet and cold amongst one's Kafir boys, huddled up beneath the scanty shelter of a few boughs, for I never carried a tent with me in South Africa, the roaring of lions is not altogether a very reassuring sound. On a still night, the roaring of lions can be heard at a very great distance, and should a party of these animals roar loudly quite a mile away, I think most people would imagine that they were within 100 yards. One reason, I think, for the diversity of opinion as to the power and volume of the lion's roar is that very few people have ever really heard several lions roaring together quite close to them, although they may believe they have done so. In 1891, and again in 1892, I spent several weeks traveling and hunting in the country between Lake Sungwe and the Pungwe River in Southeast Africa, and there was scarcely a night on both those trips when lions were not heard roaring, often as many as 3 and once 4 different troops of these animals appearing to be answering one another from different points of the compass. But although on the second trip I was alone in 1891, my companions, who had not had much experience in the veldt, often thought the lions were very near to us, and yet I am sure they were never within a mile of our camp. When a party of lions are together, perhaps on their way to drink after a meal, one of them will halt and breathe out from its expanded lungs a full-toned note, which rolls afar across the silent wilderness. As it draws in its breath for another effort, a second member of the party emulates the leader, and then a third, a fourth, and a fifth perhaps will join in, and all of them then seem to vie with one another as to which can produce the greatest volume of sound. And it is a fact that at the climax of the roaring of a troop of lions, the whole air seems to vibrate and tremble. Of a sudden, the grand booming, vibrating notes cease, and are immediately succeeded by a series of short, deep-toned, coughing grunts which gradually die away to a mere hissing expulsion of the breath. Then not a sound is heard until, after an interval of a few minutes, the grand competitive roaring peals across the lonely veldt once more. During some few out of the thousands of nights I have lain on the ground, beneath the stars in the interior of South Africa, I have heard lions roaring pretty near my camp, but never quite so near as one dark night in 1879. I was returning from the Chobe River to where I had left my wagons in the Mababi country, and was alone with 5 Kafirs. One evening, just at dusk, we reached the last waterhole in the Sunta River. We had made a long march in intense heat, as it was the month of November, and we were all so tired that we made no camp nor collected much firewood, but just lay down on the sandy ground round a very small fire. Not long after dark, we heard a troop of lions roaring in the distance. Presently they roared again, evidently nearer, and roaring magnificently at intervals. They continued to approach until there could be no doubt that they were coming down to drink at the waterhole close to our bivouac. This waterhole was situated in the bed of the river, at the foot of a steep high bank, on the top of which we were lying. A game path led down into the riverbed some 15 yards away, and the lions were coming down this path. The night was inky black, as the sky was overcast with heavy clouds, for the rainy season was close at hand. Our fire had died down to a few embers, and it was useless looking for wood in such darkness. I don't think the lions ever noticed our dying fire, or ever had any idea of our close proximity to the waterhole, as, after having roared about a quarter of a mile away, they walked noiselessly past us along the game path, and descending to the riverbed, commenced to slake their thirst. We could hear them lapping the water when they were drinking. They roared 3 times in the riverbed just below us, and the volume of sound they emitted when all were roaring in unison was nerve-shaking. My Kafirs sat motionless and silent, holding their hands over their mouths. There were no trees of any size near us, only small bushes, so they could not make a run for it to any place of safety. They confessed to me the next morning that, when they heard the lions roaring so near them, their hearts died, meaning that they were terrified. And although I myself was not then of a very nervous disposition, and moreover I believed that when lions roared loudly they were not hungry, and would therefore be unlikely to attack a human being, I was very glad when they at last left the water and we heard them go roaring back to where they had probably been feeding on the carcass of a buffalo or some other animal before they came to drink. I certainly do not believe that lions roar when approaching their prey, for surely such a proceeding would be as foolish as it would be for a burglar to whistle and sing whilst committing a robbery. But they will sometimes roar loudly in the late evening or early night, just as they leave their lairs and set out to look for prey. Lions sometimes give vent to a low purring growl, very different in sound to a roar, which may be a call note to others of their party, or if driven off by shots from a horse or an ox they have killed in the night, they will growl loudly. In approaching a camp with the intention of killing oxen, horses, donkeys, or human beings, lions are absolutely silent, as I believe they always are when approaching any kind of wild game. I believe that lions often roar when they have killed an animal and before commencing to feed, and at intervals during the night as they lie around the carcass, and they certainly often roar when on their way to drink in the early hours of the night, but probably after they have killed some large animal and made a meal. The roaring of one lion or party of lions undoubtedly excites other lions within hearing to roar and answer. I once heard several lions roaring loudly throughout the night, and even after the sun had risen the next morning, and I found that a solitary male lion had approached a party consisting of another male, 2 females, and 2 large cubs, standing as high at the shoulder as the full-grown females. The single male was, I imagine, jealous of his married kinsman, but feared to engage in deadly combat with him, and so contented himself by roaring defiance at his rival, who answered with counter-roars in which his whole family joined. The next morning I just missed getting a shot at the unattached lion, but killed the other, a very fine but hasty-tempered animal, as he charged me at sight without any provocation. In countries where lions have long lived undisturbed by human beings, and where they have really been the undisputed lords of the wilderness, they roar very freely and may often be heard even after the sun had risen. But when white men suddenly invade a well-stocked game country and disturb its peace by continual shooting, lions gradually grow more and more silent, till it becomes rare to even hear one roar at all, though there may still be a good many of them about. The African lion is essentially a wilderness hunter and a game killer, but when man, whether savage or civilized, encroaches upon its preserves, killing or driving off the game, and bringing in cattle, sheep, and goats in their place, then he preys upon these newly introduced animals and wars with their guardians to the death.